Awesome. Welcome, everyone. Over to you, Saskia.
Thank you. We'd like to, as Beck said, start the session with a karakia, so that we can all sort of bring us all together in this hour where we're going to share some of our thoughts, that we can sort of leave our day-to-days behind, although obviously with the kids and the pets and the food, that's all still good. But we'll do the karakia. Feel free to join in as well if you like. Can you bring it up on the screen, Bex or Torian? Ko te kawa o runga, ko te kawa o raro, ko te kawa ora, ko te kawa ora. E runga e whakarihia ki runga, turuturu o whiti, whakamaua ki a tina, tina, huie, tai kie. Thank you all again for joining us tonight. It is really, really nice to have you here and to share a little bit about what we do at the Mind Lab and what we do specifically at the postgrad Leading Change for Good. Diversity and inclusion and all the perspectives around that is definitely one of the topics that we will also cover, or that we do also cover as part of Leading Change for Good. One thing I want to tell you straight away is that unfortunately we got a call from Martin King, who was going to be here today, not very long ago, that he had a health crisis in the family, so he couldn't join us. But as we are the Mind Lab, we are very agile, so we've changed our presentation a little bit, and we can still totally run a workshop on diversity and inclusion with all the skills that we have. But we also know that, like Beck said, there will probably be a lot of skills and knowledge within all of you. So we definitely would like you to join in as much as you can and share your perspectives and views on what we will be talking about as well. So I'll share a very tiny little bit about the Mind Lab for those that don't know who we are. I won't talk too much about that, but the Mind Lab was set up in 2013 by Frances Valentine, and she's our amazing CEO with incredible future vision on what is required, really, I suppose, from an educational perspective. And in 2013, she saw the need of teaching kids skills in a gap that was basically between the schools and the skills that were required, or that she saw being required for the future. Very quickly actually realized that it wasn't the kids that needed the training, but the teachers that needed the training to help the kids get the skills, and for the teachers to get the skills for future learning. And from there, that was incredibly successful. That was, I think, the most successful postgraduate teachers program run in New Zealand. More than 5,000 teachers have gone through that. And through running that, a lot of other gaps were identified and more programs were set up. And Leading Change, if I just go into that straight away, is one of the latest programs that was developed, again based on a gap that was identified within that teacher's master's program, talking about leadership, and especially leadership in purpose-led organizations and communities and government and all the other places where we interact. Something that we talk about a lot, but skills are actually not taught a lot yet as part of our educational systems. So that's what we're trying to address, really talking about authentic leadership, incorporating the beautiful Indigenous values that we and skill sets and knowledge that we have here in Aotearoa, and talking about, and deeply talking about, things like diversity and inclusion. So I'll introduce the team a little bit. Like I said, there's a few of us on the call today already as well. You saw Bex and Fee there. Torian, who's going to lead the main part of the session, is part of our corporate innovation team. And you can see here on the slide also Haley, a national academic manager, and Tracy, a program coordinator, who is having some lovely time off at the moment as well. So I will now hand over to Bex to do a little bit of the intro discussions that we're going to have.
Tēnā koe, Saskia. Thank you so much. And yeah, really a big pleasure to be here as part of the team helping to bring the Leading Change program to life. And I think where we wanted to start with this, as Saskia mentioned, we're very agile and we kind of get this, terrible call from Martin that something's going on in his family. We want to make sure that this is still, completely and, 100% what we wanted to deliver. So I think what would be a fantastic place to start is to define some things together. So, without all understanding and all being on the same page, it can be quite hard to move forward, be quite hard to set goals and to set things in action. So we thought that a good place to start would be to be on the same page. Now, if you signed up for the course for this call more than a week ago, we actually shared with you this podcast. So it's a Brene Brown and Unlocking Us podcast. And she had Aiko Bethia on, who is a DEI, so diversity, equity, and inclusion expert. And she really tapped into some interesting definitions. And I thought it would be an interesting thing for us to kind of what's our own definitions of both of diversity, inclusion, and equity. So, and then we can have a bit of a discussion around that. So Torian, if you wouldn't mind going to the next slide. So we're going to start with diversity. So, and I just want to start by saying that this is a safe space when no one is here to call out each other. There's no silly questions. At the Mind Lab, we're all about being your authentic self, bringing your authentic self, feeling valued, feeling like your opinion and your voice matters. So please, if you're not here for that reason, then don't be on the call. We really want people that are in that same mindset and are willing to open up and, be challenged too. So if you wanted to pop into the chat what diversity means to you, so what your understanding of diversity is, or what it means in your role, or, you personally, and just, give everyone a few minutes to just kind of pop in their thoughts in the chat. Yeah, so Haley's come through with difference. Yeah, what makes us all unique? Variety and expansion. Yeah, so like not having that single-minded, it's that expansion of ideas and that variety and difference. Keep them coming. This is great. If you'd prefer to, you feel free to take yourself off mute and say it out loud if you'd prefer rather than chatting. Yeah, diversity of thought, diversity of experience. United we stand despite all of our differences. I love that. Every person has something different going on and everyone experiences it differently as well. Yeah, that's beautiful. Everyone's lived experiences contribute to what they're actually experiencing out there in the world. So Rochelle said thinking, feeling, learning, experiencing in all different ways and honoring this. Yeah, so it's not just about, accepting it. It's honoring it and acknowledging that's nice. The beauty of the differences. Fantastic. So I'll just share Aiko Bethia's kind of definition is very close to what's been discussed there too. That diversity really it's every characteristic trait of humans. But really what it comes down to when we're talking in a corporate sense is diversity that matters. So that is about, she had a beautiful example that, you can have a panel and on that panel you could have 3 people and they could all be University of Auckland graduate 2019, University of Auckland graduate 2020, and University graduate 2021. Is that diversity that matters? Is that experience, vast enough? So I think when she talks about the characteristic traits, she talks about the protected classes, so that's race, gender, nationality, ethnicity, national origin, but also things like different abilities, different lived experiences, welcoming the LGBT plus QI community, differences in mental health also. So that was really the discussion there around diversity, and there's been some great chat that's come through too, so I appreciate that. We'll move on to inclusion. And if you wanted to put in what your thoughts were around inclusion. appreciation of the differences, including everyone regardless of their backgrounds, making space for everyone to be involved in a way that aligns with their uniqueness, being comfortable speaking without judgment. The lollies of all flavors, I love that. Everyone has a voice, accessibility for all, accessibility again coming through there. These are all great answers. Not a rigid hierarchy when expressing views, space for all to be heard, supporting a sense of belonging. Absolutely. This is really what ICO taps into, is that you can have diversity, you can have a collection of people, but if they don't feel valued, if they don't feel included, if they don't feel like their voice matters, their lived experience matters, then you've only got diversity and you've not got inclusion. So I think, again, in that corporate sense, it's gone away from having a diversity manager to more of a diversity and inclusion. And then I think that third layer is equity too. These are all fantastic answers. Thanks everyone for being so open and willing to share their thoughts. This is fantastic. We'll pop onto the third one, which is equity, and finish off with that. So what does equity mean to you? I think we have quite an interesting perspective here in Aotearoa too around equity. Yeah, so Susanna said equal status. Fair and impartial, equal outcomes. Yeah, awesome. So really, the definition that came through was that equity is intimately connected with why we talk about diversity. And again, it started out with wanting to have integration, which was diversity, but really it's actually not just about that level playing field, it's actually about bringing those others up and understanding and acknowledging that we're not actually starting from the same playing field. So recognizing people that have been systemically or historically excluded and then doing everything we can to bring that up. So I think hopefully that sets a good sort of definition for us all to kind of think about this session as we go forward with what diversity, inclusion and equity means. And you know, we always love to be challenged too. And if there's other versions, you know, this obviously only a couple of people's views on it. So feel free throughout the chat, if there's any articles or anything like that you've got that have some other interesting definitions, feel free to throw them in there and we'll be reviewing them ourselves. But I am going to pass over to the lovely Torian Butler, who's going to be leading a beautiful presentation that he's prepared for us all. And then feel free, if you've got questions throughout, pop them on the chat, and myself, Saskia and Fee will be able to do our best to answer them too. Kia ora.
Awesome. Oops. Let's see. Hi, everyone. I'm Torian Butler. I am Director of Innovation at Tech Futures Lab, which is a sister organization to the Mind Lab. And I teach once or twice on our Leading Change for Good class. I get asked to teach or speak about equity and diversity and inclusion, I think a lot of times because I'm a Black queer man. But I like to say I like diversity and inclusion because I love superheroes. That's my primary identity. So I'm a nerd and I like to help people. And I think that, you know, part of my like obsession with superheroes and all of that kind of, you know, drove me to kind of a career around how do you change the world? How do you kind of lead change? How do you kind of make the world a better place? So I've kind of been a student of psychology. I've worked in technology, building new platforms for helping people do charity. And I am soon to be a PhD student studying how our social networks impact our brain and ultimately impact the types of people in our aspirations. So while diversity and inclusion is very integral to my life because of how I appear to people, but I think it's also more emotional to me because of how I view my own primary identity, which is being a nerd and wanting to be a superhero. And because Power Rangers has like every single race, I want teams that have every single identity on my superhero team. So with that, I'm going to talk a little bit about futures. So at the Tech Futures Lab, which a lot of the work that we do is we think about technology and trend scanning to think about what are potential futures for the world, what are potential futures for businesses, and kind of how can you use frameworks of futurists. And in this talk, I'm going to kind of talk about how you can use frameworks that futurists use to kind of help us shape the way we talk about diversity and inclusion, and ultimately kind of help organizations think about their strategy around diversity and inclusion. I think a lot of times personally, it's really challenging working in disruption and innovation space. We have workshops all the time with businesses, and they're so excited about things like, private businesses going to space or planetary travel. They're excited about smart cities. They're excited about things like, self-driving cars, or, even the capacity for humans to kind of build a city within 2 weeks, for something like Burning Man. But the moment you say something around social disruption or something around, equity or radical innovation, or, kind of, if you change the internal infrastructure of, how are different people representing your business, everyone wants to tell you something, oh, that's too costly, that's too impractical. You talk about greater diversity in STEM, they're like, oh, the pipeline's messed up. We don't have, enough people learning about this early enough. You can talk about smart cities, but you can't talk about, how can cities be more integrated or desegregated? Those conversations don't happen as often. Things around free public transportation, or the fact that, even though we can build cities basically in the deserts in 2 weeks, we still struggle with guaranteed affordable housing. And I've always found that to be like quite a weird paradox when you teach an innovation, is that, these things, we can dream about the future and somehow people get really stoked about it. But then kind of trying to solve some of the challenges today, some people will completely ignore, particularly, in many corporations and organizations. So I kind of want to say, in this next session, kind of talk about what do futurists do, and kind of maybe how does this bold visionary that some of these, tech leaders and kind of the way that they kind of forecast these transformative changes, how could, people as diversity champions and people who are trying to change some of these social impacts, can they kind of learn or kind of use some of these same techniques that, allow Elon Musk to kind of somehow build, Tesla with investment? Can we use similar techniques to kind of transform our organizations in our companies, in our society? Futurists often kind of map possible futures, and feel free to jump in at any point in time you have questions or you want to kind of talk, just ask me something. Futurists often kind of use the cone of possibilities to kind of think about the future. So with any future, if you start on the left side here, there's like where we are now. This is the current state. And there's kind of a thin line. As time goes, the futures kind of expand. There's more kind of possible futures as time expands, because the idea is obviously you cannot predict the future. However, if you kind of stay in this, you can kind of sense or predict a likely future. So as you keep kind of going, you can kind of see scans, you can kind of see what types of trends, and these are going to create like probable futures, this yellow line in the middle. However, as you kind of get away from the yellow line, there's more kind of least possible futures. So there's kind of things that are plausible. These are futures that maybe could happen, and there's kind of possible, which, it's possible, it's a possibility of a little slim. And there's what people call kind of preposterous futures, which are, there's not a lot of information kind of moving us towards that. There's not enough behavioral changes or technological changes. However, these futures, and also Bex, if there's ever any questions, please, let me know. There's possible futures, that are kind of, a little bit more what we may consider outlandish. Futurists and kind of strategists kind of think about, along this future spectrum, what are the preferable futures? If we actually as an organization want to kind of change, where we're going, we can kind of start creating the strategies and start investing in the technologies, or making the actions to move us from probable futures to kind of the preferable futures, where the things that we want to happen can happen. So, during these types of work, you're kind of thinking about, 10-year to 50-year to 100-year horizons, thinking about, what factors need to come together in order to move us from this like probably likely future to the one that's kind of most beneficial to us as an organization. I think what I get really frustrated is sometimes is it's, when you talk to people around, huge infrastructural change, somehow self-driving cars is preferable. And then you talk about, the 50% of the Fortune 500 being like female CEOs, people will say that's outlandish. And it seems like, we can invest in all of this technology, all of these, things that almost feel science fiction. Those are our preferable futures, but it's not something that's kind of doable now. I just try to thinking about structure and kind of the fact that, that 50% of the world is women. We could have that very easily. People will tell you that those are impossible futures at times. And so I've always kind of struggled with that, like the idea, and I'm in the next section, I'm going to kind of talk about, how can we maybe, and, Elon Musk and kind of a lot of kind of these technologists, what they kind of think about is they actually do map these kind of possible or preposterous futures. And they kind of say, you know what, actually, I am going to move the world towards this direction. And, they'll have, and they kind of, and the next time I'm talking about the strategy that they use. So a lot of kind of technologists and futurists, they use what we call backcasting, where if there is a preposterous future, they say, this is the world I legitimately want. And they kind of, from that vision of what they want, they step back, they set this in, I want this vision in 30 years. They step back every single step in action and assumption that they have to kind of overcome to achieve that vision. So they think about what the end in mind is. They're not kind of pushing the present towards that. And like, just like, you're not looking at current state and thinking, okay, what can we do in the next 5 years? How do we move a little bit, nudge? They literally say, I want this vision. This is the future I want. And they say, what are the assumptions that are preventing me from kind of acquiring that vision? What are the actions I need to be taking? What are the solutions I need to be moving towards? And so kind of taking that through kind of my own personal thoughts, I thought about the vision that I kind of want in the future, which is kind of this idea that corporations and places where we work, everyone can feel included and everyone can kind of be their authentic self. And I kind of, as a psychologist, as someone who kind of studies psychology, thought about, what are the assumptions that are holding us back from futures that seem very plausible in terms of diversity and inclusion. So I'm kind of walk you through some of those assumptions and some of the psychology of, kind of how we can kind of prove that some of these things are false and how we can better talk about diversity and inclusion in organizations to move us towards these visions that I think we all collectively aspire towards. And this kind of saying, like, why can we envision the preposterous and fail at kind of low-hanging fruit? So I think one of the biggest assumptions, and having worked with organizations, having been in a corporate, is that people always kind of articulate diversity and inclusion work as, oh, we should do it because it's the right thing. And even, in my opening kind of conversation, I said, I wanted to be a superhero, and that's the right thing, is to kind of have diversity. But I think the assumption that we have to prove and validate, and actually it is true, and have people talk about, is diversity increases performance and it actually improves innovation. If you take 1,000 companies, you look across, their executive leadership team, there is, year over year from 2014 to 2019, McKinsey has kind of done this survey. If there's more women on your executive leadership team, you'll get basically like a 15% in performance in your increase in your kind of financial performance. You'll have a 25% increase in the products that you deliver by 2019. And, kind of, this is the top quartile of organizations or kind of, of diversity are having major wins in gender diversity. Similarly, if you look across ethnic diversity, if you kind of, kind of over the years of the change, if you have kind of more ethnic or racial diversity amongst your executive leadership team, you're more likely to kind of have high performing financials, as well as deliver more product innovation. A recent study kind of out of Stanford Business School was kind of like, well, we're noticing this trend that diversity leads to better performance for companies. And they kind of wanted to look at why is that so? So if you get two groups, they in a study, they put a homogeneous team, they had a heterogeneous team, and they had them solve a mystery. So basically had a teams of 10, and everyone got a little bit of information that, ultimately, if you brought it together, you'd be able to kind of solve this mystery. What they realized for homogeneous teams is that they came to consensus faster, but however, these are racially homogeneous teams, they didn't share as much information with one another. It was like kind of, there was a little bit of less effort. They kind of assumed in some ways that everyone kind of had the same information, and there wasn't much discussion trying to kind of unpack different people's biases or assumptions around this mystery. What they also kind of realized, what was pretty interesting around this, is they also had these groups then have to prepare an argument or a presentation to a group of people that they could see, which were racially similar to them. And what they realized is they also spent less time preparing a defensive argument than the heterogeneous team. The heterogeneous team, they increased debate. They shared more information and discussed their hidden assumptions. If they were similar to the last group, if they were going to have to prepare their presentation to a group of, different type of assumption or different identity, they realized that these groups spent more time thinking about alternatives, thinking about how would someone debunk their argument. So they actually, developed more novel arguments. They kind of went through a bunch of more scenarios. This has happened racially. They've also did the pre-practice. They kind of repurposed this research as well, and had people do the same thing for, if a group of Republicans and a group of Democrats had to prepare for an argument to the opposing party, or an argument, they spent more time preparing for, an out group or someone that was different in some type of social way. Yes? Was that a question? Okay. They actually spent more time also preparing for a different group's identity. So actually, diversity and the present of diversity makes us be more prepared. It makes us need to be more prepared. And it helps us combine more information, which is ultimately kind of the fabric of innovation. And it makes us seek alternatives and ultimately kind of create new things. Another assumption I think we have to challenge as we kind of move towards these preferred futures is there's a lot of conversation, and I think this kind of goes to diversity inclusion is supposed to be charity work, that, marginalized groups need assistance, they need mentorship. And I want to kind of scratch that. D&I in itself, and I think that's becoming more of a trend, it's work. It is, it is part of the fabric. It's designed to improve our capability. It's kind of improving our process. It is like in a reflection, in an action that requires effort, meaningful effort, and it's ultimately should be done to make businesses more efficient and better. I'm going to show a quick video right here that I think that really
we've always thought of mentoring as
our ability to kind of flip the assumptions in our workplaces.
The older generation passing down wisdom to the young, but there's a huge benefit to flipping that around and allowing the novice to teach the master. The workforce currently consists of up to 5 generations, and it's becoming more diverse across all spectrums of underrepresented groups. But that change is not arriving nearly as fast in C-suites and in boardrooms, which means there's a growing gap between leaders and their people in regards to their perspectives and experiences. Our organisations can fall right through that gap into the trap of stale thinking, blind spots, and having policies that could alienate these underrepresented groups, not only in regards to age, race, or gender, but all different kinds of viewpoints. Reverse mentoring could be an antidote to that tunnel vision. But making reverse mentoring work isn't as simple as finding a mentor and pressing go. You have to be genuinely curious about learning from that individual, and you have to be intentional about the relationship in order to make it valuable. I know this because I was asked just a year into my career at Virgin Atlantic to be the first ever reverse mentor, to mentor CEO Craig Krieger. I'd met Craig a few times and presented to him in meetings, but it was a whole different ballgame. Craig had revealed that he had no black women in his inner circle, and he was keen to understand my perspective on how to build a more inclusive culture at Virgin Atlantic. No pressure. Here's what I learned about how to make reverse mentoring.
So I think this is kind of really speaks to my perspective on the fact that, this isn't charity. This isn't, if you really want this equity and this inclusion, we have to start really flipping assumptions, thinking about mentorship models don't have to be old and young. They don't have to be, the CEO to, they're, an intern. There are infinite lessons that we can learn from each other. We have to build the infrastructure for that. We have to build the assumption that everyone in an organization has equal value to kind of present and teach each other through.
We've always thought of mentoring.
Another example I've always thought pretty fascinating is, and sorry, a lot of my experience is going to be from an African-American male perspective, is the NFL, which is 75% African-American, only has around 6% of, and around the early 90s to early mid 2000s, only around 6% of head coaches in the NFL were African-American or minorities. And there's always been this infrastructure that, we don't have enough, the assumption that there's not enough African-Americans with the talent, they don't have the chops to do this. They don't have enough junior coach positions. They're not getting trained enough to be effective coaches. So I think in 2003, the Rooney Rule was introduced, where essentially for any head job in the NFL, any coaching job, at least an African-American had to be interviewed, or a person of color had to be interviewed. And just creating this rule, quickly, tripled, almost 5 times, the number of people of color coaches. And it was simply just by saying, let's break this core assumption that, they don't exist, and actually put the time in and the infrastructure to say that maybe they do exist, and let's give them the time to speak to us and prove themselves in an interview, not kind of, eliminating their existence before they've even given the chance. The next one is that biases are biological and therefore unavoidable. Biases are definitely part of our brain. Our brain uses biases all the time to kind of make decisions, to kind of be more efficient. But we also have to be honest that, just because they exist doesn't mean they can't be undone. Biases are learned and they're constructed. And I think what often kind of, people feel a little uncomfortable about is that if you are intentional about your circles, you're intentional about your biases, they will reduce over time. Overall, historically, this kind of is for the US, but it's also kind of globally, at least to some extent, true. Our biases we're becoming less. So this is from a meta-analysis of the implicit attitude test, which is basically a psychology test that you get a bunch of words, and you choose whether this goes to a group of, like maybe African Americans or white people. And there's basically it measures your implicit hidden biases, without on your subconscious level. Over time, since this research was first being implemented, biases, at least in the US, have decreased drastically for race and skin tone. One of the most significant ones has been towards sexuality, which has had a massive drop off in how people are biased. So basically, the higher the number up is on the left side, this is the more intense people's biases are, their preferences for the preferred group. So if it was race, it's for white skinned people. If it's is the preference on this left hand side. But as you see, people are dropping off. Sexuality has been a really fascinating case study for psychologists, as well as people who work in communications, because it has become so, the bias has dropped off at such a fast rate. And researchers have realized that, what has made this happen is that people being able to connect with or see people who are in their same social circle, who may be a sexual minority, has really impacted and reduces people's biases towards LGBTQI members. At the same time, also, there's an interesting research that says, if you have someone who you trust, or someone who you believe in, someone that you is a, who also has reduced biases towards a specific group, you are more likely to start accepting their or adopting their own perspectives. So it really matters what leaders think and how leaders present themselves, because if people look up to you, they're going to copy and mimic some of your biases or your lack of biases, essentially. So it's really important for us to think, how do we give our leaders the powers and the tools? What are leaders' roles in really shaping culture and diversity? They need to be active speakers. They need to be showing people the behaviors that they want to mimic. People need to be exposed to different groups. And ultimately, we also need representation. We need to be surrounded by stories and the opportunities so that people can, learn more about others. This next relation to biases is something that happened to me when I was working at my first job. I was working really hard on a project, and I was actually on my summer vacation, and one of my coworkers, he sends me this text, and it goes, do you remember when our boss asked me to tell you to be less gay at work? Well, I take it back. And so I had remembered this experience. Like my first few months at my first job, which is Capital One, I was told by another gay coworker that I was coming off as too homosexual, I guess, at the office, and that was really changing people's perception. That was a negative perception that I had to dial it back. I needed to be more professional, they used the word professional, which I knew was very much coded for you needed to be less gay, less authentic. You needed to be someone who fit this culture and this mold of how we work. And it was a pretty terrible experience. It really shaped the next 3 years I worked there. I should have quit immediately, but I was young. I was like 22. So that should have been definitely a tell sign. And it really makes me think a lot about how we are given as minorities all these subtle cues and these implicit biases that people are aware of and will use those things and are tactics to essentially force you to work in a way that may not be true to yourself, and how those things really cause you stress and cause you work, and maybe even ultimately impact your ability to perform and succeed. And a really interesting, almost wild study, similar with Stanford, at a business school, they asked a bunch of college CEOs to rate faces. They asked them to rate them on trustworthiness. How trustworthy do you think this person is? How smart do you think this person? How effective do you think this person would be at their job? The joke is you shouldn't be able to rate anybody specifically on their face, but these students, gladly rated, what was, they came out to be the CEOs of the Fortune 500. And what kind of came out of these was a specific types of bias. They always rated men with higher competence. Even these women, were higher leaders of the Fortune 500. They were just kind of considered higher warmth. Their kind of confidence was kind of pretty average. Asian CEOs were rated with higher competence, but however, lower warmth. Black CEOs were rated with lower competence and lower warmth. However, if you had kind of like a baby face as an African-American, they would give you like a higher warmth, higher competence. So it's kind of this idea that, with even in our categories and the people that we see, we kind of we can easily make assumptions about their intelligence and how trustworthy they are and how much we can kind of believe in certain people. And this has massive consequences, actually. So if you take the same study and you kind of run it across a group of 2,000 people, a bunch of different categories, they've kind of done the scale, and there's kind of these 4 categories or quadrants that kind of emerge. People with high warmth, kind of low competence. So you see in this top left corner, people that they rate that people generally kind of have a bias towards, they kind of view as high warmth and high competence. So these are people who are the middle class professionals, Irish, which is interesting, and Americans. People who they rate kind of with low warmth and low competence tend to be people who are on welfare, people who are, kind of some racial minorities, and, poor Blacks. People with high competence, however low warmth, tends to be kind of the rich, Jewish people, whites, and Asians. And what's interesting about this is that actually people have different competitive styles and how they interact with these types of groups when they hold these types of biases. So for typically with high warmth, low competence, we have a paternalistic stereotype where we think of these people at low status, but they're not competitive. So we kind of do things that, we feel bad for them. We tend to, this is kind of, you do charity when you interact with these groups of people. People with low competence and low warmth, kind of as a generalized rating. These are people that we consider low status and we kind of interact with competitive nature. So we think of these people when they approach us, we run away, we avoid. We think about, you can even think about how specific countries talked about COVID and the way they kind of said, it's about the economy. We can kind of ignore these groups of people. Really kind of our behaviors toward them tend to be, in some ways, often violent, or at least kind of adverse. People with high admiration and high warmth, these are people we admire. They have high status. We don't treat them competitively. We kind of seek them out. We try to find them. We try to become closer to these groups of people. And people with high competence and low warmth, these are the people who are envious. We also kind of engage with them in competitive manners. So you can kind of see, even in this implicit small bias activity, some of these things are playing out on very large social scales where we're kind of seeing some of the competitive nature around some specific groups or countries, or even the way that you may, interact with people at your job, or on, kind of thinking about, who do you admire? Who do you kind of seek out because of their status and you find them non-competitive? Who do you kind of, judge in your relationships as someone, I don't trust this person. And you should really kind of spend some time thinking about that. And you can probably, as you think, see these things play at a larger scale. I think my last one is going to be this idea, and because we just talked about competition, is that people often frame work and performance as this competitive nature, that the jobs are scarce, promotions are scarce. There's like a win versus someone who wins is someone who loses. And I think we have to start thinking about work is value-based, and everything you do with work is it's an opportunity for growth and community. It doesn't have to be this thing that it's inherently competitive. The reason I say this is because creating conditions of scarcity really exacerbates our biases. During recessions, the number of kind of searches of hate terms spikes. They've done recent studies where basically, if you put students are kind of people, are coworkers in a situation where resources are scarcity, they tend to kind of overemphasize characteristics of race. They actually start, coding people who are light skinned. They have a study kind of where they say, you see someone who's kind of racially ambiguous. If people are in a scarce condition, they are more likely to think someone's face is darker. And these are all kind of ideas that we tend to, for some reason, when we create these conditions of scarcity, our biases, our need to create different groups and in-groups and out-groups are exacerbated. And I think work inadvertently in trying to get people to perform better often creates these scenarios where people dehumanize one another. And you can really kind of see that how that can impact racial minorities are those groups of people who are kind of in that category of competitive. So what does this all mean? I think personally, as champions of diversity, we have to build processes to get our organizations to face their own assumptions. And I think that realistically, the only way we can do this is we can't just have generic diversity and inclusion goals. We can't have, psychological safety just be our what we're striving for. I think we have to say what is our ideal state, and we have to kind of be really specific, and we have to kind of work on that future vision that we want and work back and map each of those assumptions on how are we going to actually achieve that. And I think for every assumption that currently exists, we have to think of what's that clear action? What is that challenge to that assumption? If you want an actual equal workforce where everyone's valued, how do you get rid of the assumption that, being older is more valuable than being younger? How do you get rid of the assumption of, all of our CEOs? How do you challenge the fact that our CEO has a circle of, white colleagues, and he's never going to actually value someone who may be an African-American woman unless he spends time with them? So you have to also ask leaders and managers to map, and this may sound very personal and hard, and I think it's a interesting activity, is to map your inner circles of friends, map who you date, who are your colleagues. Does this actually match this vision of diversity that your organization envisions? Because if it doesn't, you're going to be inherently kind of moving towards, that echo chamber of your own biases. You have to create your vision of diversity and inclusion, and you have to kind of help leaders push to build that roadmap and infrastructure for it. And lastly, an organization, you have to try to check in on your biases, but think, how do certain systems and processes exacerbate these competitive biases? So thinking about, what are our systems that kind of create this scarcity mindset? What are systems that could potentially, cause people to view each other or dehumanize each other in little subtle ways, or create that competition that actually kind of creates those scenarios where diversity is not going to be allowable. And if all that doesn't really work, go disrupt your industry yourself. There's a whole book called The Innovators Dilemma, which talks about why do big companies tend to not innovate, and it's because they kind of focus on, the most valuable consumer to them. And it's your opportunity as, minorities and swifter and kind of people pushing those to go find those small opportunities. And you can be like someone like Whitney Belk, who is the founder of Tinder, who basically, after kind of the founder of Bumble, my mistake. So after kind of, experiencing a slew of kind of biased, awful kind of language around women, actually went out and said, what if I solved what is it like to be a woman online and through dating? And she kind of created Bumble, and a simple interaction from that experience of understanding what women go through on online behavior, created one of the most, made her the youngest woman billionaire ever. So that's it. That's all I have to say.
That's awesome. Thanks so much, Torian. I've just popped in the chat. If anyone has any questions that you'd like to ask Torian, feel free to do so in the chat. We do still have about 12 minutes before the session, and we've just got a couple of minutes at the very end where we'll just cover off a few bits and pieces and then do a closing kind of care. I just want to quickly say that I loved that idea around, it's not quick wins. It's not like these small little things that you can do and just hope that you'll get there. It's actually about that really bold looking into the future and looking at where you want to be in either in your organization or even personally, thinking about where you want to be and then working backwards and kind of mapping that out just makes it sounds like it's such a better way to approach it than just doing small little quick things. I think that was really great, Torian.
Thanks, Bex.
We've got a question from Kelly on here, which is, any suggestions on how to talk to someone who is stuck in their ways?
I think there's a great TED talk on this that I can lead. I'll reach out to you. There's also a group called the Storytelling Project, which has a series of questions to help people deal with difficult relationships regarding politics and diversity, and could be things I think also related to sexuality. And they have a script to help you kind of talk through these questions. And yeah, I mean, I think it is hard to change what we may call laggards. I think as this kind of goes to that same point I was saying, is the best way is for them to find the people that they are inspired by, the people who are kind of part of that in-group that they have, people that they look up to, and seeing if you get those people to be converters, because there is something around, as our social circles change, as our social networks change, and we kind of see what they believe, we start to kind of move towards those directions as well.
Awesome. Any other questions or any comments? Anyone want to share an experience or something that they had? And
Just
definitely
to add a comment, Bex and Torian, was when you went through the slide around showing the American Football League side of things, where the graph of everything started to change once they actually brought people to the table and started to interview them. Interestingly enough, in New Zealand we have the same challenge as well, that we have a very low Pacifica attendance when it comes to coaching and management, etc. And some of the people on this call will have experienced an amazing speaker that we had, Tracy Artiga, who came from Kanaloa, Hawaii Rugby, and spoke to the group about the challenge that they have as well. And they did a huge research piece with, I think it was AUT from memory, about it. So that slide really resonated with me, because we have that same challenge here in New Zealand. We certainly haven't fixed it, but Tracy is really trying hard to see if we can really change the face, so that the players can start to see themselves in their management and have somewhere to go.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's, and different companies are starting to do the same thing too, but I think it is, I've worked, prior to kind of coming to New Zealand, I was at Columbia Business School, which is one of the top business schools in the world, and they have a huge endowment, and they were saying we can't get enough Black or brown PhD candidates, and their whole reason was, we don't have the pipeline, like the students aren't trained well enough. And I was like, you have so many resources, like you have systemic levels of wealth. You can literally, you've bought basically the top half of New York you own, and you're going to tell me that you can't somehow increase, the average percentage of students who can kind of get into the school or train them, or, just some little things. We just tend to think, that it's impossible to, flip or move something just because we haven't built that infrastructure before. And you have to build it. That's kind of part of it. Like, if you want to actually change something, you have to invest in something that will push that needle, or you will have to kind of make a change to your processes. And I don't think organizations like confronting that sometimes. Robert has a question about a sense of belonging and inclusion. Yes, I definitely think belonging and inclusion is very key. This is how I feel about this, Robert, and I don't have the exact answer here, is every organization that I felt really included in was somehow diverse. I can't say every organization that was diverse I felt inclusion. And I don't really know, I found that people who create inclusive communities in organizations, there's something about them, I don't know, where they, try to create, and I'll talk about the Mind Lab in the sense that it is such an inclusive place. And for some reason, I know we talk about diversity and how do we kind of get representation, but it kind of happens some ways naturally through kind of the people at Francis interviews and the people that come through. I've worked at a company that's, we want more diversity, more diversity. And you join as a diverse hire and you're like, this is awful. This is a terrible place to be. This is how Capital One was, I was like, they're, champions of diversity. We have all these pride things and all this stuff. And in that moment, I was like, wow, this is not even tokenized. I just feel like terrible because you have clearly said, you know, we want you here on paper, but we want you to be like us, and not represent the experiences that, you know, may be unique.
Awesome. There was
Megan
another
has a
one
question.
too from, I think if we just go back a little bit, Bryce has also said, thanks, Torian. When living in the UK, I like to think I found that broadening my social work circle, even with people from other cultures and origins, even if they were also white, English, Italian, American, etc., also opened my mind. Does this sound valid based on your experience and work?
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think opening your circles are, you know, we kind of like to think of ourselves as like, I like what I like. My preferences, you know, are, you know, I pick my friends because we like the similar things. And that's probably very true, you know, and I don't think it's always kind of controversial, but I do think there is some value to say, you know, I actually want to meet someone who's a little different from me or culturally different from me. And I think that really changes the way you think. I think it changes, you know, you kind of talked about kind of diversity that matters, which, you know, there's kind of different cultural diversity. There's also 2D diversity. So there's people, you know, who are similar to you, but kind of, you know, may have been white, but they grew up in a very different culture than you. That kind of also changes, you know, their perspective. And, you know, we are very different culturally and emotionally. Culture shapes the way we experience emotions and the way we talk about them as well. So I think it is really important that we collect as many experiences from a bunch of different people, and we have to listen to do that. And but I also think there is some value in, you know, you have demographic information about New Zealand, and you can definitely be like, does my social graph look like New Zealand? Does it look like Auckland? And that sounds like a very weird thing to kind of confront yourself about, but if it doesn't, you may want to ask yourself, how am I not meeting different people? How is this going to kind of exacerbate or compound, you know, if I have children who aren't being exposed to different cultures, because I don't have friends who are like different cultures, you know? So it is really important for us to kind of, you know, take some time and say, maybe I need to go to a different cultural event. Maybe I need to kind of meet some people who are a little different from me. Maybe I need to push my comfort zone, or ask myself why. I don't. And it feels a little weird, you know, I know it kind of feels weird, probably say, I would be really weird if someone was like, I want to be friends with you because you're Black. But I would, you know, be kind of okay, let's have a conversation, because you clearly never talked to an African American. So maybe I need to be the first person that you talk to about Black experiences. So yeah.
That's awesome. It's that like being comfortable, being uncomfortable too. Like all of this it's not comfortable. It shouldn't be. It should be, you know, you're challenging things. So that's awesome. Yeah. We're almost at time, but I think we'll just quickly check through the comments to see if there's anyone else that's come through before we kind of close off. Forgive me if I'm pronouncing your name wrong, Senja. When have you last time done something for the very first time? Maybe that's something maybe we can all ask ourselves too, is doing something different and pushing ourselves as well. And Nikki suggested volunteering is great, as you often find that those who need to be given to are also giving back. So that's a good place. So maybe it's finding those different spaces to be in where there are people that are not just like you.
Totally.
Which is awesome.
100% agree.
So Torian, after this, I'm going to hound you and I'm going to get all those links from you about reverse mentoring and about that TED Talk and the storytelling project. And then we'll send out a real jam-packed recap email tomorrow that will have those links in so that you guys can dive a little deeper, as well as this recording. And if you do feel like it's something that you would love to share with a colleague or a friend, and maybe it's something that they are wanting to get into, then of course. And then I feel like I could just quickly cover off the last little bit too. So Saskia obviously is our wonderful program lead for Leading Change for Good, which is our incredible new postgraduate certificate that we run. It's a 9-month program. It's designed to be run alongside your normal everyday job. So it's not about quitting your job and doing work. It's about doing it alongside it. And all of it is very practical, hands-on learning sessions, very similar to this, open, honest korero, with, you know, great guest speakers, people like Torian. So you're listening from lots of different people and getting lots of diversity in the people that you hear from too on the course. So I'm not sure, Torian, you're actually able to just quickly share your screen again just for those last couple of slides, if that's all right.
No worries.
That would be awesome. We do have an upcoming info session. So of course, this is more of like a topic-based session, which we love to run, a bit more of an interactive one. We do also run just a really straightforward info session, which is all more about the program specifically, if you're thinking about joining up, because we do have 2 intakes starting this year, one in June and one in September. And the very good news is there is an early bird cost. So there's a 25% discount on at the moment if you apply 4 weeks prior. So that takes the cost to just over $2,000 for an incredible 9-month postgraduate certificate, you know, professional development out the wazoo. But feel free to register for that Zoom link for the info session. We'll put a link for that in the email also. So I think that's us, 8 o'clock. We value your time so much. We hate running over these sessions because we value your time. So appreciate you joining. I will stay back. I think Fee and Saskia will probably stay back too, just for a little while. So feel free to hang around if you've got any further questions.
Awesome.
And then we will just close off with a karakia too. If you can pull it up. If not, I've got it here. I could just quickly run through our karakia.
Oh, would you like me to pull it up again?
Yeah, if you could. Saskia, did you want to close off? Or?
I can, Bex. Thank you so much for talking about leading change. That was really good. And thank you, Torian, too, for leading us tonight in a very quickly changed session. That was really beautiful. And I hope all of you have picked something up from it that you may not have heard before in regards to diversity and inclusion. And there's a lot more that we can talk about, as you all will probably realize too. We've done a very quick session, but we could easily add another hour, I think, to talk about, because we haven't, for instance, not even talked about othering as a concept, which we do talk about, and it does come up as part of our leading change discussions as well. But anyway, I will indeed not go over more of your time and do the closing karakia. So if you can put on the next slide.
Oh, for some reason it's not. Oh, there he goes.
There we
Sorry,
go.
it wasn't showing for a second.
Kia whakairia te tapu, kia waitea ai te ara, kia turaki whakata ai, kia turaki whakata ai, homie, huie, taikie. Thank you so much all.
Tēnā koutou.
Ka kite.